Welcome back, folks, to the WP-Tonic show. It's episode 593, and we've got a real friend of the show, a personal friend, lead instructor at LinkedIn Learning, a philosopher, and a well-known internet personality. But I'm sure you resent me saying that, but he is. We've got Morten Hendriksen with us. So, Morten, would you like to give a quick 10, 20 intro about yourself?
Well, you just did. So
yeah, this whole Stephen.
You pretty much covered all the bases.
Yeah, Stephen, would you like to quickly introduce yourself to the listeners and viewers?
Yeah, my name is Stephen Souter. I am none of those things, but I do run a small little company called Zipfish, and we optimize WordPress speeds both on the server and on your site.
And what we're going to be discussing in this episode, we're going to be discussing ethics and big tech. Really, the two things probably don't go together, but Morten agreed to come on the show. It's been something that he's been passionate about for a while, and I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic discussion. But before we do that, I just want to mention one of my main sponsors, and that is Custos. And Custos, if you're looking to go into podcasting, you need a platform that will send your episodes in RSS feed, and that's what Custos does. It basically hosts the audio file and then it distributes it through a RSS feed to things like iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and it also provides a host of other services that if you're into podcasting yourself or for clients, you're going to find really useful. They've got a fantastic interface. When I moved to them, I actually paid for the service out of my own pocket, and then through discussing them, they said that they would be interested in being the main sponsor of the show. I've just been delighted with their service, and you should go and have a look if you're interested in becoming a podcaster for yourself or for your clients. So, Morten, with our Friday roundtable show, increasingly it seems like a Groundhog Day episode, because we seem to be talking in almost every Friday show about some tech company that has got themselves into hot waters when it comes to ethics. This Friday, for example, we're going to be talking about Basecamp and their suicidal journey into self-implosion through a lack of probably insight and ethics. Do you see a general pattern here, or do you think it's just the general madness of every age? Only a small question, Morten.
Yeah, I mean, that particular situation is not just. It's not just. Sorry, I have a very itchy tag in my shirt. That particular situation is not merely an issue of a lack of ethics framework for that company. That is an issue of a lot of things that just coalesced into one enormous problem very rapidly. I
would say a pass-field ball that was just waiting for a lance to burst it.
Well, if you try to take a step back from Basecamp specifically and look at the type of issue that they're running into, right? It all starts with a discussion around diversity and inclusion, and the reality that the world, and specifically North American and Western European world, and even more specifically the tech world, is only now really coming to terms with the fact that diversity is a value that you need to apply to your company if you're going to have any type of success. But if you push forward towards any kind of diversity or inclusion, it will feel to people who have had enormous privileges since the beginning as if their rights are being taken away. It manifests in many different forms. One of them is that we start becoming more aware of what our language is doing to people, and how a lot of the cultural language we use, a lot of the jokes and colloquialisms and everything we use in our everyday language actually creates an othering system where you say that this is funny because it applies to people who don't look like us, or people who don't believe in the same God as us, or people who somehow don't belong in our in-group. And when those issues are brought up, a lot of people, because they've grown up in a society where this is considered to be the norm, feel like now we are being attacked for just being who we are. And there's the movement towards diversity and inclusion is to say, maybe that culture is broken in some way. And we need to take a step back and look at our own culture and see if our culture is somehow harmful to other people. And I'm not saying our people as in me specifically or a group I'm belonging to. I'm saying every single person needs to look at this, because human beings are wired to group people into stereotypes, and stereotyping of people is actually the reason why we're able to function in society as a whole. The problem is when we have stereotyping that becomes automatically negative. So you say like, because people look or behave or present in a certain way, we attribute to them traits that don't actually have anything to do with the fact that they look or behave a certain way. Then we are running into a situation where you get implicit bias and over time systemic bias, and then you end up where we are today. Now, what is happening in Western culture specifically, what is happening in tech culture even more specifically, is that when these issues are raised, the people that are sitting in power positions feel like someone is trying to take their power away, and that power was somehow divine to them through their amazing work, right? And in the tech world in particular, we often hear this term meritocracy, which is used to say that, the reason why you bubble to the top is because you are the best at what you do and through merit. But any research into any and all research into meritocracy shows that is not at all what is happening. It's mainly luck and people who are willing to step on other people to get to where they're going. And there's this really good quote from, what's his name? I can't remember, but he basically says that, I'll remember in a second. But he says that meritocracy is when people inhale too deeply of their own success. It's basically like, you may have had some success and then other people helped you step up, but then you choose to be unaware that other people helped you, right? And in all that, we end up in a situation where you kind of have the powerful resisting any type of change, because any type of change would mean stepping away from some power. And what they're not realizing is stepping away from some power means letting other people in, and those other people may actually contribute in ways that previously were unavailable, right? And if you have insufficient policy around this, and insufficient insight and insufficient culture around these types of issues to be able to discuss them in a rational way internally in a company or internally in any type of culture, you end up with what you have in that situation, which is when the discussion starts, it gets too heated immediately because people aren't used to discussing these types of issues, and they don't have the language and they don't have the social structures to be able to have discussions about things like values without starting passing value judgments on each other. And then everything collapses. And then you get someone who says, no, we're just not going to talk about this at all, because if we talk about it, people start fighting. And then they shut down communication. And then all the people who feel like that was the first time they ever got to voice their opinion feel like they're being excluded even more than before. And all the people that feel like that discussion was somehow infringing on their rights to be the best they can be feel like those people who say, hey, that was the first time I ever got to talk about it, are attacking their values. And then you have a complete implosion. And all of that is to say, there is a systemic issue in our society, and especially in our current society, of not being able to have cognate conversations about these types of issues because we're way too quick to pass value judgments onto other people. And you hear this all the time when, like, if someone says, if someone brings up any kind of diversity or inclusion or anti-racism or any of that thing, and you have a person who is deeply conservative in the room, they will immediately label them a social justice warrior and then nullify the conversation and say everything you say is irrelevant simply because you fall into this bucket. And in doing so, they're effectively saying this conversation is not a conversation. I am not listening to anything you're saying. We're just not going to have this conversation at all. I'm just going to keep throwing labels at you. And then you have the same thing from the other side, that they will say, well, you're just a conservative, or you're just like, what is it? What is the new term they're using? Instead of RNCs, the RQC, like people who are so Republican, they're in the Q spectrum, right? And in doing that, they're being like, they're labeling people as like, you are just inherently evil or stupid, and therefore we can't have a meaningful conversation with you. And the entire conversation just breaks down. And what's needed, I think, is for everyone to start applying this very old term, which is solidarity, to their communication, to say that I am with you in this, especially if you're working in the same company, you are actually in something together. And you need to be able to extend solidarity to other people and also extend grace to other people and say, what we're discovering here in our conversation is that we live two entirely separate lives where there's almost no overlap except for the fact that we work in the same space. And this is an opportunity for each of us to learn about the other person's lived experience and then accept the other person's lived experience as a true description of their lived experience. So when someone says things like, I don't feel safe doing X, instead of saying, well, that's big, like, I don't feel like that, so therefore you must be wrong, or I don't believe you, or you're part of some giant conspiracy to do whatever, say, oh, tell me more about that. Because that is a window into someone else's lived experience. And it's really interesting because if you look at this whole concept of things like harm, you'll discover that if you have someone who says they're being harmed, you can always have another person saying that didn't happen, right? And you actually need a third party in that conversation to be able to judge whether or not something really happened. Because in the way that humans think is that every person can have a completely separate experience of the same thing. It's that whole, four blind men are presented with an elephant and like it's a snake, no, it's a tree, no, it's a wall, right? Unless you have a third party observer who is completely impartial to it, you won't be able to pass any type of meaningful judgment that can be accepted by the rest of the world. But that requires that that third party is willing to be an impartial observer. And that's super hard to do in a society where we are polarizing everything and very rapidly passing value judgments on people.
I think that's, before I throw it over to Stephen, I think that's my observation of that last comment is very relevant, because people would say that social media has been one of the major tools that has polarized and it's been used as a magnifying glass for a situation that's become even more toxic. So, Stephen, over to you.
Man, I feel like so much has been said. There's like so many different pieces to dive into there. But I think something that I've been wrestling and thinking around a lot is this idea of prejudging somebody based on like the idea that they're espousing, like you're just saying, like, they start saying something conservative that maybe has like a really good point, and you automatically just like dump them into, the Q camp or whatever, like whatever that comes next, like has no relevance. Or whether you're profiling somebody based on ethnicity or race or visual appearance, like all of those things, there are some things that are like higher, like more hot topic button issues. And for good reasons. But like they all boil down to the exact same thing, that you are like looking at something or you're hearing something and you make a bunch of judgments after that. But the crazy thing to me is that that's like, as people, that is what is inside of our nature. Like that's how we're supposed to work, right? We can't function without categorizing and without putting people into boxes and to be able to navigate through the world. And that doesn't justify somebody from doing that. You need to figure out how to draw lines around that. But where do you draw that line? Because you can't just say like, no, don't categorize anything ever, treat every human being exactly the same. So, somebody who walks into a store with a gun, like, oh no, I'm just going to treat them like another human and not a threat. Well, that's too far, because that's a crazy example. Yeah. But like there's a line that is good and a line that's bad.
It's not though, because if you walk into a store and a person walks into a store with a gun, there are certain situations where you'd be like, this is normal, I have no problem with it. It depends on what they're wearing. If they are wearing something that presents like a police uniform, you're like, that's fine. Heavily armed person walking around the store, I have no problem with that. If it's someone who's wearing like hunting gear and is carrying a rifle, you're probably going to be like, interesting choice, probably not very legal, but I'm less concerned about this person like doing something. If it's someone who's dressed like I am right now, right? Like if I walk in with my hoodie up and sunglasses, basically like what was it someone said, when I walk outside and I have a hoodie on and sunglasses and my mask, apparently I appear extremely intimidating to some people. Like this huge guy who basically is unidentifiable. If I walked like that and I had a weapon on me of any kind, people would be super concerned, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the wrong context. And that's exactly the stereotyping thing, right? Now, I just want to recommend to the 8 people listening, there's a book called Blind Spot by a bunch of different authors. It's a nonfiction book. There's a whole section in that book about stereotypes and how stereotypes work in the world and how stereotyping is the sorting mechanism we use for everything. Like like when we talk about stereotypes, we always think immediately like, stereotypes is you see a person who looks a certain way in the world and then you make value judgments about that person. In reality, stereotyping is like, I hold up something like this and then your brain immediately goes, longish thing, kind of tapered on one side, probably a pen, right? That's stereotyping. Is like you have a categorization system where you very rapidly try to put things in boxes.
Yeah.
And for humans, there's like, I think it's 7 stereotype traits that you use, and using those 7 types, you can categorize every person in the world, right? And it's this super interesting thing where if you are talking about, if you want to describe someone in the world, so you observed something happening on the street and you want to describe it to another person, there are these immediate things you hit, right? You say like, you start by saying how big they were, like, because you can sort of judge age by size. Right? You then describe probably their presented gender, because you look at people who are like, this person presents as male or female, right? And then you say like, this looks like a woman or looks like a man to my understanding of what that is. And then you go to other very defining characteristics like the color of their hair, the color of their skin, the color of their eyes. But in doing so, you're not actually saying anything about the quality of the person or their values. All you're saying is the picture I have in my head right now is this, and the way that it got classified in my head is down into this category, right? The problem then is if you go down that rung, and then the second you say had dark skin color, a bunch of other things attached to it, like probably something, like when you do this, it's like they've done all these tests where they say like you just show people pictures of black and white people, and then people have negative value judgments about black people and it even happens with black people. There's another book called Whistling Vivaldi, which is super interesting, that talks about how people will internalize the stereotypes or the negative stereotypes that are given to their group to the point where they will actually underperform as long as they're aware of it. And they've done tests where, for example, they have athletes, like track and field athletes, where they remind a white track and field athletes that white track and field athletes tend to underperform in competition with black athletes by virtue of being white. And the white athletes will underperform more than they normally do just by being reminded that there is a value judgment stereotype applied to their group. Whereas if they are told that in this particular test, even though you are white, that stereotype does not apply in this circumstance because this is a test that somehow invalidates all that stuff, they will overperform. So our internalized value judgments based on what we think other people think about our group impacts what we think. And that's when it's like, when we talk about things like diversity and inclusion, you realize that this is systemic in a much deeper sense than simply saying, you know, oh, society is evil for grouping people. This goes into our personal internalized systems. And the reason why we need to do things like make sure that all groups are equally represented in boards, or even just in advertising on TV, or any type of situation where people can see themselves in that same situation, is precisely this, that if people internalize a specific type of stereotype that applies to themselves, they will underperform in situations where they shouldn't, simply because they think that they're carrying the burden of proving that their group is better than whatever stereotype it says. So it's directly harmful to people. And this is one of those, you start a conversation about like making fun of people's names, right? And it seems like, oh, you're just not being fun anymore. In reality, what you're talking about is, when we do this on a systemic basis, people internalize these types of attitudes to the point where they are not able to function to their best in society. And that is what we need to turn, right? So this very superficial conversation is actually about the nature of how humans behave. And how
we need to go for our break, actually, and then when we come back, I've got some more questions. Hopefully, Morten can stay on for some bonus content as well. We'll be back in a few moments. We're coming back. We've had a bit of a discussion of ethics and Basecamp. Before we go into the other part, the other section of the show, I just want to tell you about a webinar that we're going to be doing on the 14th of May. That's Friday the 14th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's going to be me with Spencer, and we're Spencer Forum of Launch Flows. We're going to be talking about how you use WordPress to build a modern marketing automation flow that can compete with the best, like ClickFunnels and all the SaaS products, for yourself and for your clients. And you can join us to ask questions live. It's going to be pushed onto the WP-Tonic YouTube channel. To get reminders, all you have to do is go to the WP-Tonic website. There's a big button that says webinar in the main navigation. You click that. You just give your name and address and name and email, and you'll be given reminders when the show goes live on the 14th. It should be fantastic. Spencer is very informative, and we're going to be going in all aspects. Now, on to the second part. Kind of leads on, you know, big tech, Facebook, Google, even Amazon, they all seem to be having some major problems lately. It just, yes, you're totally correct, but it just seems the intensity and the public focus around big tech and their involvement in social media and other issues seems recently, since the pandemic, seems to have focused even a lot more. First of all, would you agree with that? And secondly, can you give some of your own personal insights why you think, if you do agree with my statement, why this is happening?
Okay, so I have to do this first. So I work for LinkedIn, which is Microsoft, and none of what I say in any way reflects the opinions or is a statement on behalf of my employer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Legal disclaimer, blah, 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 right? I'm in a position where I get to talk to people about things, but you have to understand that I'm talking purely as my own opinion and not as that of anyone else, nor a representative of, etc. That said, I'm not going to speak about Microsoft or LinkedIn in any context because of my employment, because that would be extremely unethical and problematic and not trustworthy or anything else. And I also don't want to speak specifically about any other company because I don't have the insight specifically into any of those things, but what I'll say is, what is happening is what I warned about like 5 years ago at a conference talk, that if we don't do something internally in our community.
Well, I just wanted to interrupt. I just want to slightly interrupt. That's why I asked you to come on the show to talk about this, because you have consistently, for a substantial period of time, been warning about this. And at the beginning, I think you were kind of poo-pooed a bit. But to be honest, I didn't poo-poo you, but I think there were some people that poo-pooed you. But what you were talking about 6 years ago has kind of solidified, really. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought I needed to do that.
No, that's fair. What is happening is the tech sector, and especially the internet-based tech sector, which is what, 20-something years old now, right, in any meaningful shape, has operated in this unrealistic world of value neutrality since its inception, in that it says, we just build products. We are not responsible for what happens to those products, and how people use those products, and what consequences those products have on the world. And that's an understandable sentiment if you are building a GitHub repo for some random thing that will be used by 8 people. If you are building a tool that's used by 40 million websites, that's absurd, because you are changing the lives of 40 million people, right? And then every person that they interact with is also changed. If you are building a social media tool that is used by the majority of the world, and then every decision you make is a decision that is world changing by definition. And the bizarre part about this is all the companies that build these types of tools and all the organizations and communities that build these types of tools are very quick to tell you that what they're doing is extremely important and changes people's lives for the better, until you say, but what about all these negative consequences? At which point they go, no, we're not responsible for any of the consequences of our tools. People use them however they want to. That's not our responsibility. We just make software, right? So there's like the messaging they're sending is like this all the time. They keep talking against themselves. What is happening now is, because we are not doing the job of regulating ourselves, of taking responsibility for what we build, governments are doing it, right? Because they have to, because they can see in their own populace what is happening when these tools are used in ways that they shouldn't be. When you have a terrorist who live streams an attack on the internet, and the platforms it is streamed on are aware it's happening, but don't shut it down until after the event is over, due to red tape, there's a serious problem. But underneath that, there's a serious problem in that the tech world has built the tools necessary and the communities necessary for someone to be radicalized into thinking that that is something that you should be doing in the first place. And what's happening now is, due to the lack of will by the tech companies to take on this responsibility, governments are coming in and saying, okay, you're not doing it, so we're going to force you. And you should actually have Heather Burns on at some point to talk about this, because what is happening is the governments, so we're talking specifically about, like, let's talk specifically about the UK and Europe, but this is also happening in Canada and the United States and Finland and Australia and some other places too. So this is happening all over the place. Lawmakers are worried that they don't really understand what's going on in this technology, and they don't want to take on the responsibility of governing these tech bodies. So instead, what they're saying is, if you have a platform of any kind and someone does something illegal on that platform, you as the platform will be held liable for their work, right? So if you, Jonathan, publish a social media network and someone goes on that social media network and performs a crime, then the government will say, okay, Jonathan, because you didn't prevent it, I'm going to put you in jail or give you a fine, right? And this is the government's incredibly hard-handed way of saying, stop being irresponsible about your product. We are going to punish you for it. The challenge in that is the same services are being used by people who need to be able to break rules to do things, right? So for example, if you live in a country with an oppressive regime in which publishing information about what the regime is doing is illegal and punishable by death, which is something that is happening in several countries in the world right now, you need some way of communicating that information entirely without risk of being identified. Because if you're identified, then you die, right? These social media networks and all these platforms give people the capability of doing this, but these laws would make it impossible for those platforms to do it, because if someone then breaks a rule or breaks a law under the umbrella of an oppressive regime, then an argument could be made that since you're not allowed to break laws, we can now go after the company, right? And then it becomes a really tricky situation of saying, like, on the face of it, you can say like, well, the world will agree that this particular country's rules are insane, right? Like saying anything negative about the government equals death is not reasonable. So we're not going to enforce this. But what happens when you get a country that says something like publishing any national security information is equal to prison for life, and then starts classifying things like oil pipeline debates around First Nations groups as national security information, right? It's the slippery slope exists, and it's very real in the circumstance.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you, Morten. Yeah. We need to wrap up the podcast. Are you okay staying on? Well, half hour goes quick. Are you okay staying on for a while? And,
I have the hour for you, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you. And,
there's no one deciding how long your podcast is. You can just do that yourself.
Well, I do a transcript as well, and it gets a bit expensive if we go over half hour. So I like to keep it around half hour. So Morten will be staying on. You'll be able to watch and listen to the extended version of this interview on the WP-Tonic YouTube channel until I'm banned, that is. And a bit of English sarcasm. Morten, what is the best way for people to learn more and about some of the ideas that you've expressed in this podcast part of the show?
Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Is the easiest. On LinkedIn, I'm Morten Hendriksen. There's only one with that ridiculous name, so it's easy to find. On Twitter, I am Morten, MOR10, Morten, because that's my name.
That's great. And Stephen, how can people find out more about you and your company?
Yeah, head over to zipfish.io and run a speed test. See how much faster we can make your website.
And Stephen and his company have been really helpful in making the WP-Tonic website a bit more of a speed machine rather than just a middle-aged loungy website. And he did a fantastic job. We'll be back next week with another great guest like Morten. We'll see you soon. But do remember to go over to the YouTube channel and listen to the rest of this great interview. We'll be back soon, folks. Bye. Hi there, folks. We're going to keep on going it. So another factor, Morten, is we seem linked to what you said before we had to end for the podcast part of the show about how government are heavily handed dealing with these problems, is we also seem to be living through the period of banning. Mm-hmm. Banning people off Twitter, banning people off Facebook, banning people off YouTube, banning people from everywhere for anything. Where does this lead to, Morten?
Less hostile debate. Like it's funny because people are very I have to say this in a way that doesn't enrage people. People who say things that are directly harmful are very quick to claim that their rights are being infringed upon when a private company says, we don't actually want you to harm people on our platform. And if you look at like there's kind of two categories of this banning. One is banning things that in any other context would result in you being kicked the fuck out of the space immediately, right?
True. Yeah.
And then the other part is people who are being banned because an algorithm breaks, right?
Well,
so we can just kind of like put the algorithm thing to the side, because like
can I just I haven't interrupted, but I just want to put this to you. I agree. I this is where it's difficult because I want to bring Stephen into it as well. Is the only criticism I have is of your last statement, because yes, I agree with what you said. There's some things, and we have laws in America, you know, if like Spencer put this example, if you're in a cinema and you jump up and say, fire, fire, and people get killed because they rush for the exits, you can be sued because that's seen as I forgot the legal phrasing, but it makes you liable because it's an action that, and so there's definitely actions on social media that if you did anywhere else would get you into trouble. Then you're talking about the automatic, but then there does seem to be a third entity where there's been a host, especially on YouTube, but also I would criticize Facebook and Twitter for this as well. But it's been really definitely on my radar connected to YouTube, where they've banned people on the right, people that I occasionally listen to, who I don't really like and I don't agree with their aspirations, but I've never seen them do anything that would be consistent with the cinema thing that I pointed out. And then there's people on the left that I definitely follow more because I'm more left-wing in my sympathies. And they've had episodes and things that they've said that have been banned. And I just think YouTube are just taking the piss, basically.
No. So it is interesting because what you'll notice, first of all, is that the people that get banned that you know about are the people that have other platforms. So when they're like, cancel culture is destroying my career, it's like, no, you're building a whole career on being canceled, right? You just wrote a book about it, earned $2 million selling that book. Fuck off. Like, seriously. There's no human right in being allowed to say whatever the hell you want on any platform, and the platform not being allowed to say, no, we're not okay with this. I mean, if you go on, I've been banned.
I wouldn't argue with you there.
So
there must be.
The idea that there is some sort of conspiracy to silence any political spectrum is patently false and has been proven again and again to be complete nonsense, right? So like there's every time some claim like this comes up, people actually go and do the research and go like, no, that's not happening at all. The one thing that keeps popping up very consistently is politicians who claim that their viewer base is somehow being culled. And the reality is their viewer base is totally being culled, as in bots are being removed from the platform, and the bots tend to follow inflammatory people to boost their message, right? So like if you go and you look at if you start talking politics on Twitter and you go look at your follower count goes like this. And what's happening is you say something, a bunch of bots start following you. The algorithm goes, this person says a lot of inflammatory stuff, so we're just going to go check all those accounts. And then it goes and kills a bunch of bots. And then it drops down. And if you're then a hypersensitive person who's very concerned about this kind of stuff, you'll be like, look, Twitter just banned a bunch of followers or stole followers from me, not realizing that those weren't followers. There was machines probably sitting in Russia, probably trying to cause problems, right? So there's a bunch of misinformation or misunderstanding and misattribution of intent and all that kind of stuff. Then you have the category of like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter just outright banning QAnon content. because QAnon has proven to be an actual dangerous thing, right? And not only that, but it's a very clear system. Like there's a very clear pattern that people who start seeing this kind of content become radicalized by that type of content. And that radicalization leads to direct harm. And the platforms, being private entities, can choose to say, we're not going to host this type of content because it doesn't fit within our parameters. And then someone is going to say, this is a slippery slope. Eventually, you'll not be allowed to say anything. To which I will respond, actually, we're at the bottom of that slope right now. What's happening right now is that everyone can say whatever they want. And if you don't believe me, you just go on YouTube and search for something you shouldn't be searching for. And you'll discover content that tells you that like the Holocaust didn't happen, that alien Martians are landing spaceships on Antarctica and stealing babies. Like these platforms are full of absolute insanity. And some of that insanity is directly harmful to people, right? And when I say harmful, I'm not just talking about you can make a direct correlation between someone saying something and a person actually physically being harmed or killed. What I mean is, do you ever watch that show, So You Think You Can Dance? It's one of the best shows on TV, by the way. So in one of those, like in a random episode, there was an audition where someone was dancing and he did something incredible. Whereupon one of the judges stands up behind her desk, puts on this extremely angry face and says, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to stab you in the eye. Right? In that context, that is like the highest level of praise, right? She's basically saying, you're so good at dancing that the only way I'll survive as a professional is if you die immediately, so that there's no risk of you ever coming in and taking my job, right? Perfectly fine, aired on every national network. No one batted an eye because it's the type of things that dancers say in this context. Now consider this. Take that exact same situation. Someone says something amazing on the internet, and that someone is someone who identifies as a woman. And then someone says, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to stab you in the eye on Twitter. That person is now in a position where they have to go, is this a real threat to my life? Or is this a very strange way of expressing praise? Now, if the person who says it is a known entity who people know says stuff like that all the time, like me, I keep saying to people, unsubscribe when they say things I don't like, right? Or like, how do I delete other people's tweets? People know that because I say it all the time, right? So if I said to a random person, how do I delete someone else's tweet? And they did a search, they'd be like, oh, this guy says this constantly. And it's always two things that he really likes, right? I should probably stop doing that anyway, because I might accidentally make someone really stressed out. But the context matters, because if saying something causes the person at the other end of the conversation to suddenly get a changed status, you are actually not just saying words, you are doing things in the real world. There's a term for this in philosophy called speech act. When you're not merely saying words, you're actually doing things that is an act in the real world. This is an act in the real world. Because what happens is the person who receives that message, their status changes from being person who published something on the internet to being person who is potentially in danger of being killed. And because of the way the internet works, there's no real simple way for the person to figure out, is this a threat to my life? Or is this just random garbage on the internet, right? And then you'll say, but you could report that to the police. The problem is the police don't have the tools to do anything about this, because the police would have to go to the social media network and say, who the fuck is this person? The social media network would be like, I don't know what to do with this. And right, so this idea that words are just words on the internet is just demonstrably false, right? And then you have to say, okay, what is the threshold? Where do we cut a line here and say that anything that goes above this line?
I just want to bring Stephen in. So Stephen, you got
this has been great. The question that just keeps running through my head is like where's that threshold? We're talking about morality, and I think what's interesting is to look at other examples of morality that we've been dealing with a long time, and just to pick on a subject, take abortion, for instance, where is it okay to abort a fetus? Is it ever? Is it never? Is it somewhere in between? What can you say on Twitter? Is it I'm going to kill you too far? Is posting a terrorist attack too far? Or is, saying shut up too far? Like there's this parameter, and there is no way society is ever going to agree on where those lines are.
Yeah.
And what is being asked by society right now just feels completely unreasonable for two reasons. We won't agree on it. And two, because it goes against the very human nature of our ability to categorize. And when people say stop making assumptions about people, it's just like, okay, like the idea and premise is good, but in reality, like, is that possible? And nobody gives us an actual solution. People just like throw up complaints and point out the problems, but no one's figured out that line. And it feels frustrating at times when it's just like all these voices are complaining about how we're stereotyping and categorizing, and we're censoring too much or not enough.
I think
how do you work that out?
Yeah, I think you made a great point there, Stephen, around, I don't want to get into a debate about abortion, definitely, but it's a great example. There are positions around that topic. They will never agree. They are honestly felt and thought.
Yeah.
And very passionate. Are you, if people, as long as they don't physically say, I want to kill you, and keep on saying that, you're never gonna have a non-emotional, factual argument about abortion. It will never happen.
Of course it will. It happens in other countries. Like, that's the thing. This has to do with the culture of debate, right? Norway just lowered the threshold for abortions even more. So they've taken away a whole system of, like, if I forget, I don't know exactly what it is because I haven't been reading up on it too thoroughly, but it was like, if you want an abortion after week 12, you need to go into some sort of system and someone has to look at your case. And they were like, this is really unreasonable. We should just take that away. So that, if people are at 12 weeks and they want an abortion, there is legitimate reason for it. They're not doing it out of some sort of I want to kill babies situation. So we should take these barriers away, because at that point in your pregnancy, you're already in such a horrible position to make this choice that it shouldn't the government shouldn't come in and further intervene in your personal decision making. And what you said is exactly true, Stephen, that this is about morality. Now, what people need to understand is the difference between morality and ethics is morality are your personal judgments about what is right or wrong, whereas ethics is what we agree on as a society to be right or wrong, right? So ethics is the tools we use as a society to make decisions about morality, where we say that if you live in this society and a part of this group, then we judge these are the ways we judge whether or not something is right or wrong. And that's how you can have, like, if you take United States and Canada and Norway, and you look at gun laws, right? You have everyone can have a gun, only very few people can have a gun, no one can have a gun, right? And in each of these countries, you will ask people, is it ethical to own a gun? And then in the United States, the answer will most likely be yes. In Canada, the answer will most likely be no. In Norway, it'll be like, absolutely not, unless you are a hunter, in which you should have like 2 shells in your house and the gun should be locked away, and you have to have a license. And those are all ethical positions to have based on the morals of that society. What we're lacking in tech is, first of all, the acknowledgement that when we talk about tech, we're not talking about a coherent society. We're talking about the world as a society, which opens problems like, how do you make a moral judgment when the world has polar opposite opinions on a lot of things? The other thing we're lacking is any type of fundamental ethical framework to make any type of judgments. And that's a deliberate choice by the tech companies and the tech contributors. And that's what I was talking about.
I would disagree with you. I would say that they do have ethic. It's the ethic. It's
Where
the
is
ethic.
it? Show me the. No.
I'm just going to tell you. I'm just going to tell.
You're making a difference between ethics as in people acting responsibly and ethics as there is an actual thing you can point to that says this is what we're doing and this is right.
If you let me put this to you, I would say that they definitely have got ethic. It's the ethic of the green. It's the ethic
That's not ethics.
of making anything, as long as it's semi-legal, we can do it as long as it makes more money.
That's not ethics, Jonathan. That's
Right.
that's like Ayn Rand level laissez-faire craziness.
So are you saying that,
well,
like,
that's what I'm saying. But that's what
companies need to have their own
ethics.
ethics?
Sorry,
I'm saying
Steve.
is, about 2 kilometers from my house, there's a bridge that used to be called the Second Narrows Bridge that is now called the Iron Workers Memorial Bridge. The reason why it's called the Iron Workers Memorial Bridge is because at some point during the construction of that bridge, the whole damn bridge fell down and killed like 52 workers. Turned out that was because some engineer made a math error and a bunch of people were killed. So in response to that, the Canadian Engineering Society, whatever, decided that, we should really have checks and balances in place to make sure that that kind of crap doesn't happen again. And more importantly, that if someone notices that something like that is about to happen, it is incumbent upon them to do something about it at risk of losing the ability to continue working if they don't. And if you look at most professions in the world, so any profession that directly touches on the lives of other people, they will have a set of ethics that they operate under. And these ethics are often, there's an international level and then there's a local level. And the ethics usually involve some form of, if you do any of these things, you can no longer operate in this industry, either for a set period of time or ever. There is a system in place to adjudicate such decisions. And if you are a professional and you know someone else is breaking the rules and you don't report them, you are at ethical breach and you can be subjected to the same type of penalties, right? And the reason why those things exist is because the industries themselves have realized what we do has a direct impact on other people's lives. And we have to ensure that the people who are part of our group behave in a way that does not directly harm other people. That's what I'm talking about with professional ethics. There is no such thing in the tech industry. The ACM has a code of ethics that they can use. That applies. If you're a member of that, the consequence of breaking those ethics is you're no longer a member, which means you don't pay a fee on a yearly basis. It has no impact on your professional career, right? What we need to do as a society, and especially as a tech community, is start to develop this type of ethics. And that starts by acknowledging that the type of work we do actually directly impacts people's lives. And this idea that it should only kick in if there's a risk of someone dying is red herring in the conversation, because there are far bigger harms that can happen than people dying, like their entire lives being lost, right? Another coherent example is that directly ties to your ethics of green is credit card companies. I'm sure if you have a credit card, you've had at some point either had a new credit card issued by your bank automatically because something happened, or you've had a fraudulent charge put on your credit card and then they get refunded. That's enshrined in law. So if credit card company, if someone charges something fraudulently on your credit card, the credit card company is held liable for that charge unless they can prove beyond reasonable doubt that you are responsible for the fraudulent charge, right? So if someone hacks your credit card, it's not on you to pay it back. It's actually the credit card company that has to fix it. And they have to fix it, like literally give you the money back, give you a new card, make sure it doesn't happen again, right? If someone steals your data due to a data breach, nothing like that exists. So the company that created the data breach is not responsible for reconstituting your data, is not responsible for fixing whatever problems that occur to you as a person, like identity theft. They're not responsible for it. They should be, but they're not, right? That's because the governments have not caught up to this reality yet. The law has not caught up, but they will. And if we don't, as a community, say, we're going to start taking responsibilities for these things, we're going to get like a huge hammer that's going to come down and say, okay, we're just going to put draconian rules on this. And those draconian rules will be draconian in like, you can't do anything on the internet anymore because the governments are trying to prevent us from doing things, but they know the second you give these people any kind of leeway, they do something insane, right? And if you talk to open source developers, if you talk to software developers, the reason why they're doing insane things is because they all sit behind this wall where they say like, I'm just building software. I'm not doing anything to anyone. If people choose to use it for bad purposes, that's on them. That is a mentality that we need to grow out of, mature out of, because it's like a teenager, right? we're behaving like irresponsible teenagers about our own technology, and it simply doesn't fly.
But isn't there something that's strange about having a company putting its ethical decisions on, like, if my credit card company is like, you know what, I don't believe in gas cars, therefore no one can buy gas anymore with my credit card.
Yeah.
And then make that decision.
They should totally do that, because you can then go to a different company, right?
Correct. But there's something.
But you're not discriminating against anyone by doing that. If they were saying you can't buy things from a store owned by a gay person, then you would have cause, because that is discrimination against someone. What you're describing is discrimination against the gas company. Gas companies have no rights. Or discrimination. The end.
But if you're discriminating against somebody's preference to drive
no, because they can choose an alternative. If there was only one bank,
but sure. But now I totally understand that these two examples are completely separate.
No, this is a really good example.
A gay person could buy a wedding cake from another baker, right? But we say no, as a baker, you have to serve everybody, because that's protected by law.
Mm-hmm.
So the government has that's the ethics that the government has created. In that same ethical.
I think you made a great point there, Steve. Another example I want to put to Morten, why if you were a black person and the credit card company said, well, we looked at our statistics,
mm-hmm.
We looked at our artificial intelligence statistics, and black people are more of a credit risk, and we no longer want to, are you, because you've got more than one credit card company to go to, are you saying that they should be allowed to do that? No, that's
systemic racism. That is the definition of systemic racism right there. But that's the thing, you can't attribute a quality of a person to some sort of trait of that person, right? So you can't say, because you are a blonde man, you are going to do these things. You can say, I have a record showing that you personally did a bunch of stuff. Like if I had 18 credit cards and I was overdraft on all of them, a credit card company could be like, fuck no, we're not going to give you a new credit card. But if they came and said, people that look like you tend to have overdrafts on a lot of credit cards, irrespective of your personal situation, that's not okay, right? And that's what I'm saying, that there are rules in place already to protect against this type of behavior, because this type of behavior happens all the time, right? What we're having trouble with as a society right now is understanding the difference between being prevented from doing things due to the fact that those things may be harmful to others, and being prevented from doing things because of some sort of systemic suppression of something who you are, right? And the classic example of that is people who say things like, conservatives are no longer allowed to express their opinions on social media, right? Which is patently false. But if we just ignore the fact that it's patently false and actually look at the statement to say, and then they equate it to racism, right? They say, or people say that there's such a thing as reverse racism, right? They're like racism against white people, right? There are situations in the world in which there is racism against white people. It is marginal to the point where it's almost impossible to document, and it's definitely not systemic. However, there is very easily documentable racism against people who are not white, right? And any type of claim that those two situations are equal and should be treated equally is just falsifying reality and misattributing a movement towards equity and equality to any type of attempt at suppressing a group from doing something. And understanding that difference, that in one case, I actually had, I have a Twitter conversation with someone because I was writing an article and I was trying to find a good example. And I said, hold on, I'll bring it up so I don't misquote myself. Give me 1 second here. Because I was trying to come up with some way of explaining all this stuff. And let's see. So I said, blah, 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 blah. How do you explain the difference between refusing to bake a cake for a gay wedding and refusing to build a website for an organization advocating against immigration? this is a situation that you'll come up against as a developer. At some point, a company will come to you and ask you to build a website, and you're like, I am fundamentally against all this shit. I don't want to do it, right? And then you're like, wait, am I doing the same thing that a baker refusing to bake a cake for a gay wedding is doing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So here's the answer, and I'll read it out.
And I'm excited for this.
The website will be used to further the anti-immigrant agenda and spread an anti-immigrant rhetoric. Therefore, helping to build it will directly enable and is directly contributing to that work. So like by building the website, you're actively contributing to a specific agenda. Whereas the wedding cake will serve to feed people sugar. You're not contributing to an agenda. The difference being against immigration is a value proposition that someone is in and can change. Being gay is something you are born with. It is a property of a person in the same way that eye color is a property of a person. And the only way you can argue that that is not the case is if you are going down the path of saying, actually, no, sexual preference is a choice, which is something some people believe in, which is not supported by any type of rational science and is a value judgment imposed on a group of people without, like, from people who are not that group, right? So when you make a choice as a provider of any type of service, you have to understand the difference between supporting a value and providing service based on the properties of a person, right? So if someone comes to you and says, we want you to bake a cake for, or we want you to build a website for a political organization, you can say no because you don't believe in that political organization's values. If someone comes to you and says, I want you to build a website to support a minority group in doing something, and you say no because I don't want to support that minority group, you are making discriminatory judgment based on that group. Like, so it's about like agenda versus property, right? And not property as in ownership, but like the thing that defines a person as who they are, right? And then the gray zone in there is some people will argue that a bunch of the values of a person are actually properties of that person, right? So you can say things like, what you believe in as a religion is a property of a person. And I am not an atheist. I'm non-religious. To me, religion is something other people have, and atheism is something other people have. This whole concept is very academic to me. Like, people believe in things, and it shapes their worldview. And I often have discussions with atheists about this idea that they say that God does not exist, and I tell them that that's a religious statement, like that they are actually being religious about it. What I mean by that is, religion is the property of a person because it changes the way they behave. But it is also, and it is like fundamental property of a person to the point where they are not they're not consciously going into religion saying, I am going to become this. It does happen, but it's very rare, right? However, you can change religion over time.
Yes.
Right? So what ends up happening is when you have someone who says, like, I'm not going to build a website for any religious organization for any purpose, that is a fair statement. You're just like, I'm not going to touch religion as part of my business. If you say, I'm not going to build a website for this particular religion because I don't believe in that particular religion, then you're in a gray area, but then you have to start looking at, like, what are religions and what are not, right? And that's it when you get into like all these fringe things like Scientology or whatever. It gets very, very sticky for these things. And that's why having a firm statement that says not touching politics and religion is safer for a vendor than trying to nitpick on individual things, right?
Which, like, I think what's interesting about you bringing up religion is there's something very different. In religion is that most religious people will say that they were not born into that religion because
they were brainwashed into it by their parents.
But no, there's built into lots of religions. There's this idea of like evangelizing and getting more people to become a part of you. And therefore, if you say you were born into a specific religion, right? You are what you were born into. Like, that doesn't support that evangelism idea. Unlike like, unlike if you would talk to a person who is gay, I've never heard anyone that I've talked to said like, oh no, like, I chose to be gay. Like it was something like, no, like this is who I am. Like there wasn't a choice, and I'm not asking you to become this either. Like I'm not trying to say you need to be this way. Whereas religion like adopts that, and I think there's something that interesting is like very different about that, or race and religion, is that religion just like try to convert people into them, and if you can convert somebody into your religion, that means you are not that at the beginning.
Well, but there's also there's a crossing point between religion and politics and religion and culture, which is really important. And that is, there is one group that falls under the religious spectrum that is actually subject to a very heavy level of oppression, because part of that group's idea is that being born by a person who belongs to the group makes you a person of that group for life, and that it's an actual property of a person, right? So it's like, it's not just that you are believe in the religion. It doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. By being born from a woman who is part of this group, you are automatically, as in, this is not a religion, this is an actual
like race, or
like a cultural type, right? You are part of the culture whether you believe in it or not. And that's why this is really tricky, right? That the way people see themselves becomes a huge part of it. And for us as tech workers, when we develop software or design software to people, we have to be cognizant of how we are affecting their lives in what we build, and how the tools we build are used to affect other people's lives. I like to say that all design is manipulation in some way, because you are trying to change the capabilities of the person you are designing for, so that they are either able to do something or not able to do something. And we as designers and developers need to be very aware of how we are changing the lives of other people and what they can do with those things, right? Because if I give someone the capability of doing something, and I know that that capability can lead to cruelty or harm or something like that, it's incumbent upon me to make sure that I do my part to prevent that from happening as much as possible, right? That could be designing in features to prevent harm from being done. It could be saying, if someone chooses to use this for harm, I'm like gonna not give them updates to my software, or I'm not gonna continue supporting it, or I'm not gonna or I'm gonna exclude them from my community or whatever, because I built it and it is my responsibility. I mean, if I put a trampoline out in my yard, and a kid from the neighborhood just walks by and jumps on the trampoline and gets hurt, that's actually my responsibility. It doesn't matter that I didn't allow that kid to come in. The fact that I didn't prevent the kid from using it is enough, right? And that has to apply to our work too. And it's one of those, like, we need to get away from this idea that we're just building software, or that we're just pushing pixels, that we're just doing this, and start acknowledging that if that were the case, we wouldn't be doing it. We do it because we want to change the world to fit with our vision. And if we do that, then we also need to take responsibility for what happens when we do it, right? And like, that's why if you go back in my Twitter feed, like years and years and years, I think if you search for Morten GPL, you'll find this. So I said that the GPL is problematic because the GPL takes away all ability from the creator for preventing people from using their creations to do harm, right? And the counter argument to that is something along the lines of, once you build something, you shouldn't be allowed to control how people use it, which is nonsense. That's not how the rest of the world works. Why on earth should it be how software works, right? That's just absurd. But more importantly, that way of licensing things, to say that the second you publish it, you lose control over it, is a moral free-for-all. Then you can say, since I have no control over how people use it, I have no incentive to actually do anything about harmful use, so I'm just not going to bother, right? Because there's no consequence. If something if I built a website, if I built a WordPress theme and a terrorist organization used that WordPress theme, no one can come to me and say, hey, you need to do something about that, because I have no way of doing anything about that, because the license explicitly prevents me from doing anything about it. And the license even prevents me from saying in the license, by the way, don't use this for terrorism, right? Which is a built-in value neutrality in a world where what we do is not value neutral, right? So we're deliberately shaping, like acting as if we live in a world where value neutrality exists, whereas it does not in reality.
Yeah, that's true.
I think we got to wrap it up. We've gone over an hour now. Thank you so much, Morten, for your time. We'll be back next week with a slightly shorter interview, I'd imagine, but with another great guest. We'll be back soon, folks. Bye.